Well, hello again. Got another video for you. This one has come out of pretty much some of the classes I teach and then some of the questions that I've been asked about the IICRC S520, the R520, the S500 and R500, and also the Texas Mold Assessment and Remediation rules. The TMARR and the Texas Mold Assessment and Remediation rules, as we call them TMARR, as these are now being augmented by some of the actions of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation in pushing the IICRC S520 and R520 and S500 into the examination documents. Well, it started something that is kind of unique. Just to give you a idea of the scope of what we're dealing with, we're talking about residential structures, but we're also talking about issues such as the requirements for insurance and then also the requirements for the IICRC. But we have residential properties and we have commercial properties. Now, in the level of just the number of what we're talking about is the amount of water damage per year. And it is, there's about $13 billion of water damages on residential structures annually. Now, I think that's 2018 to 2019 numbers. There are about 10,000 water damage incidents in residences every day. The cost on each incident is about $10,000 per event. So some of that is mold and some of that is in Texas. But one of the things that's a difficulty about some of the IICRC or the guidance documents out there, they talk roughly about what some of the things that the IICRC S500 and S520 require, but it really isn't delved into as much. In Texas, we now have the Texas Mold regulation, and that is regulated by by TDLR. As I mentioned earlier, they now have put an emphasis on the Texas regulations and the S520 and S500 into the examination for licensure in our industry. So this video is going to address the effects of the IICRC standard overlay over the Texas Mold Assessment and Remediation rules. So I think it's going to be an interesting thing that you probably haven't thought about before. And you'll answer the question when you hear people say, or it's in a protocol or work plan, well, follow the IICRC S520. Well, we're going to delve into that a little bit. Now, the Texas Mold Assessment and Remediation rules was one of the first mold regulations issued by a state. And in 2004, I had the privilege of getting hired by Jebco Associates and developing a mold training program, one of the first accredited training programs by a third party, really, in the country. Now, it can be disputed. You had some IAQA and some AIHA training as well, but this was really third-party accredited required training where none really existed before. It was revolutionary in 2004, and it required the separation of the consultant from the contractor side. So if you want to do the assessment and the protocol development and also addressing the issue of clearance as well, that needed to be separate. Now, in the state of Texas, it is separate. I think Florida also has the requirement that it be separate. Some of the other, I think New York State also has the requirement that the mold assessment consultant be separate from the contractor as well. And again, this is given third-party oversight. Most of our insurance is that way as well. And when you get to the IICRC, it's somewhat muddied, but it's pretty clear once you start working your way through the IICRC S500, S520, I mean, that's the mold remediation standard. So in 2017, the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation took over the administration of the Texas Mold Program from Department of State Health Services. And they didn't really want the program. And in one of their actions they tried to do is they tried to get a hold of the standard and go like, well, we've got this standard everybody follows and we don't need regulations. So that's kind of where this really started. Problem with IICRC S520 or any standard really, ASTM or whatever, it's voluntary. it doesn't have the force of regulation. Somebody can't give you a fine or say you need to pay attention to this or whatever. So that's the difference between having a standard that's voluntary and consensus driven as opposed to a regulatory requirement that puts a floor on compliance. And these are levels that the bare minimum of what would be accepted. The unintended consequences of Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation now emphasizing the IICRC S520 and R520 with the Texas rules and having that more in line with what the test requirements are. Well, that has had some unintended consequences. And one of those unintended consequences is it's basically made the IICRC a de facto standard in the state of Texas. So before TDLR took over and before the emphasis of IICRC, almost everybody we taught, most of the training providers in Texas, was on the EPA mold in commercial buildings and commercial and school buildings. And the reason why it was short, it was concise. Most of these standards are fairly similar in the basics of what's going on anyway. But that unintended consequence now, because we have to teach that because that's what's taught on the class and we have to provide the standards in class, it's become the de facto standard. If you go back in time and consultants and contractors that were licensed in the past, since it was basically EPA, that's what we taught. Well, now we're teaching IICRC, and in that situation, you're going to have people now referring to that more because that's what they're familiar with. Just like they were familiar with EPA before, now they're familiar with IICRC. The newer folks are now. So anyway, that's one of those things. Now, again, this can have an issue when we get into compliance. So some of the basic things we talk about in the IICRC S520, R520, and S500, we have to talk about what the standard of care is. And there's a great video out there by IICRC, the steering committee that put one out on YouTube in 2015. The middle part of it was talking about these things. And one is recommended, you don't really have to follow it, but the standard of care is the shall and should. So when there's shall and should that is appearing in the standard, you need to comply with that. So if it says should, you probably ought to. It's kind of not as harsh as shall. Shall is pretty clear. But should would be, well, if you don't, you better have a damn good reason why. And that's the key thing. Now, they also have in I believe it's section 9, especially in the R520, they have deviations from the standard of care. So if you don't shall and should, then you're deviating from the standard of care, and those have to be addressed again, and this is by a should as well in the standard. And if you are deviating from the standard for whatever reason, asbestos, lead, mold, whatever, you document the deviation from the standard and the need for that deviation. Second thing is you communicate with all materially affected parties. And if you can't communicate with those people in an effective real-time basis, documentation of those said communications. And it should. There's also a little blurb in there on S520, page 35, 9.3.4, should adequately document. That's what it says, should adequately document. So if you're not, you need to be, deviating from standard. And it's recommended doing that should and getting written authorization or obtaining consent or approval. And that's say it's recommended. So you should document the need for the removal. Document the need from the deviation from the standard and the standard you're deviating from. Communicate with all materially affected parties and document that communication. It's recommended that you also get authorization, obtaining consent, etc. So as I said, the standard, when you look at it, it is a very good thing. And if you look at the Texas Mold Assessment and Remediation rules, the requirements of separation, licensing, and all these other aspects that are there, they are strengthened by the S520 and R520 and S500 as well. We've got some nonsense going on with some of the S500 and S520 with the restoration and disaster recovery on some of the drying with mold, calling it water damage when it's mold. And some of the insurance adjusters are basically playing this game too. It's not a very good game to play because there's all kinds of problems that can come out of it. So on listing the limitations of the R520, page 100 to 102, chapter 9, the limitations, and it's also in page 104 of work stoppage. So we've got, what we have here is, this is the standard, it's the one we're talking about. This is the S520, it's the thin one. So this is the standard. It has a companion document of the R520. So this is the reference that basically backs up the discussion that they don't make. This is what got approved by ANSI, and this supports that document. So in this one, in the R500, if we go to page 101 and 102, it talks about the limitations of the mold remediation here. It says restrictions that are placed upon remediators by another party that result in a limited scope of work. The remediation activities or expected outcomes can include, but are not limited to, the source of water has not been corrected. This is a big thing. The IICRC is very, very vehement about the water source must be identified and must be corrected. There's no gray area in this standard, and it says shall, and that's in one of the principles. I'll get to that a little later. Remediators told to remove visible mold and ignore settled spores, condition 3 to condition 2. Now we're going to go over the conditions a little later too. It's hard to take this document all in place, all at one time. The remediators told to clean up conditions 2 and 3 in a structure and ignore the HVAC system. Again, this is a lot of, it costs too much to do that. We always hear it costs too much. Remediators instructed to return contaminated contents without cleaning them. That's we have some problems with that. Conditions 1, 2, or 3 has not been determined. Funds are limited, or the appropriate use of containment is limited or prohibited. So only an owner or an owner's agent, not the remediator or others, can impose limitations. And this is one of the problems. We have limitations imposed when we get to program work or insurance work, that limitations are put on by the insurance adjuster. And that is a big thing. They're not the owner or the owner's agent in that situation. They're deciding who pays for it. So as I said, there are some things that come in as well. Now, because I didn't want to start in condition 1, condition 2, and condition 3, is because of the departure of the IICRC S520 and R520 from the square footage requirements. Now, these square footage requirements have been interpreted, and people know that it's 25 square feet of visible mold, or it's 10 square feet of visible mold. Well, when you get into the standards and the guidance documents and what they actually say, with these levels of increasing aggressiveness or increasing protective requirements for mold, it's a big deal. So the size of the area under the Texas Mold Assessment Remediation Rules, and if you want to know more about this, I've got a video dealing with the Texas rules. So this is kind of a companion to that. It's like, you got to take this into consideration when somebody says IICRC S520. So the TMARR is 25 contiguous square feet of material that needs to be cleaned or removed. So if you say, well, I got this much visible mold and go 2 feet past, that 2 feet past is included in the contiguous square feet. And that is consistent with OSHA and the New York City guidelines and EPA as well. None of them say visible mold. Right before the table 2 in EPA, right before the designation of the different levels in the New York City guidelines, the old ones or the new ones. The old ones were more like OSHA, Safety and Health Information Bulletin, brief guide to mold in the workplace. The new New York City guidelines are more on EPA's levels. And here's what OSHA says. OSHA says these areas, less than 10 square feet, 10 to 30 square feet, which the 30 square feet, they go up to 1 wallboard panel. 30 to 100, greater than 100 square feet. And they go, before they say what this square foot is, it's the square foot of mold affected area. So you can go read the SHIB. You can Safety and Health Information Bulletin for mold, called the SHIB, and it basically says that. It's not visible mold. The New York City mold guidelines, area impacted by mold growth. So it's not necessarily a visible. EPA, based on total surface area of contamination. or area contaminated. So it's not just the mold growth, it's the spores that can be dispersed and settled. And that's consistent with the IICRC S520 on the mold remediation guidance. So none actually state visible mold growth, even though it's quoted by consultants all over the country. None of it is about visible mold growth. You can identify visible mold growth, but that's not also the contamination, and the area has to be cleaned. Again, the state of Texas says the area has to be cleaned or removed, and that is consistent with the IICRC S520. The 25 contiguous square feet, the 30 square feet, that's just a wallboard panel. Less than that is you can do it on your own with your own people. Above that, almost all the guidance document says you probably ought to use somebody who knows what they're doing. Now, the IICRC S520 and the R520 made a departure from the square footage of visible mold in paragraph 3 in the IICRC S520 in the foreword. And it says, quantifying visible levels of mold growth alone is not feasible as an action level criterion because it does not take into consideration hidden, concealed mold growth and does not take into consideration dispersal of spores and contamination. So that is a big departure. They don't even want to go to the square footage of that because they're also talking about spores that could be moved, dispersed. And this is where the IICRC has 3 levels of condition. Now, these 3 levels of condition can be seen several different places. It's in the IICRC R520 in the assessment and the preliminary investigation that a contractor would do. Also in the definitions of both books. And also it's reiterated in, I believe, some of the accompanying documents in the S500 as well. But here we have the 3 levels of IICRC conditions. And this condition 1, this is what I alluded to earlier, was normal fungal ecology. The next one is contamination, i.e. spores and fragments dispersed directly or indirectly from active growth, or condition 3. Now that would mean if you had mold in one area and you had high airflow and a return in that area, it could disperse through the HVAC system or through positive pressurized in that room if it didn't have a return and blown out, like some mold in a bathroom being blown down the hallway because you overly pressurized that particular bathroom. So condition 3 is not active mold growth. And again, it's not really, somebody has to look at it and make that determination whether it's contamination and dispersal. Condition 3 is active mold growth and spores and fragments. So this would be, if you want to know what we're looking at, we could have condition 1 in a bathroom that probably has an automatic exhaust fan that turns on every time somebody walks in it. So it would never be positively pressurized while people were in there. And it's probably unlikely that would be dispersed. But if it was dispersed, it'd be dispersed by air pressure down the hallway a little bit. So that'd be condition 2 a little bit from the hallway. However, somebody went in there and just knocked a hole in the wall or did drying and said, well, we're doing drying, we're not doing mold, and they opened that wall up with no containment, and they would disperse spores at that point in time. And that's where the S500 comes in. This is dealing with water damage. And this is a big one when we get into this. This is the next one we're going to talk to because we have some shenanigans going on that we need to address nationwide and also within the state of Texas as well. So we're looking at conditions, not square footage. And remember, the IICRC is also dealing with hidden or concealed mold. We've had some consultants who are going like, oh, that hidden and concealed mold, that's all scare tactics. Well, no, it's in the standard because nobody has x-ray eyes. You have to open the wall to check into it. And there's a lot of issues there down the road with some of our new growth woods and the way we have built for a while. Now, the S500, the water damage restoration standard, operates under a standard of care 2. And shalls and should are the same as it is. Again, the same group that did this one also did this one. So they took their ethics and everything else from the same, cut it from the same cloth, if you will. So here you have shall and should. So this standard is also, again, under the same deviation practices as the S520 as well. So if we look in this one here, page 25, section 8.6. Now, this is where we have a problem with some of our practitioners in the restoration industry, or those who aren't licensed for mold in our state, or I don't want to mess with the mold, it's water damage, or water damage takes the precedence over mold. So this is out of the standard. So remember, anybody IICRC certified is supposed to follow these standards. And if they're not following standards, they better be showing why they deviate from them. Hence the reason why this video is being put together. So here it is, page 25, 8.6 on mold. And this is on the water side. If restorers encountered mold growth during the course of the restoration project, water damage restoration activities that may disturb the mold should stop until such a time the area or existing or suspect mold contamination is contained. Further drying and mold remediation in the potentially contaminated area should be performed by trained remediators following the current edition of the S520. Restorers shall follow applicable federal, state, provincial, and local laws. So this gets into the old discussion in the water damage and mold. Well, what if I have a little bit around baseboards? Or what if I have a little bit in a bathroom? Well, a little bit is a little bit. You're doing an assessment on looking at whether it's a normal fungal ecology. Now, this is where the state of Texas rules come in and go like, yeah, a contractor can do that, but they can't do it for the purposes of an assessment. You have to get an IEP, or our state in indoor environmental professional, IEP, is a mold assessment consultant. So it calls in that one as well. So it's very straightforward. As I said, you look these things up, they're clearly in the standard, and it's easy to check them out. The problem is people don't read books anymore. And when they do read them, they're bored with them and they want somebody to explain it to them in a video. So that's, again, the reason for the video. Okay, so they may disturb, should stop. So if they don't stop, then they would be in violation of the standard. They'd have to fill out a document that they deviated from the standard and why. So restorers shall follow all laws. So page 36, 10.4.2 is another one we go over. Okay. This is regulated and hazardous materials and mold. If a regulated and hazardous material part of the water damage restoration product, then a specialized person must begin to assess the damage. Restorers shall comply with applicable federal rules. Okay. For situations involving visible or suspected mold, refer to the ANSI IICRC S520, but qualified persons shall abate regulated materials or shall remediate mold prior to drying. Shall remediate mold prior to drying. That's a big standard. It even goes a little farther. Evaluating emergency response actions. Okay. An emergency is various reasons. We have emergencies for hurricanes where we give blanket exceptions and exemptions, but then we have emergencies to where it prevents our hands from being tied. Well, one of the things that the restoration industry and some water damage people who don't want to mess with mold or don't believe, or whatever, okay, they call it water damage and go like, we need to take care of the water damage first. That takes precedent, got to get the store open. Everybody's worried about getting things open. 10.7.1, this is on page 41. Restorers shall identify and manage potential safety and health hazards. During the inspection process, restorers shall make a reasonable effort to identify potential hazardous materials that could impact building occupants or might be disturbed. I mean, it is very, very issue. You're supposed to be looking at whether it's mold or what's going on. Okay? We have on page 49 of the S520, 13.3, remediation procedures for category 2 or 3. Again, remediation should occur prior to restorative drying. When they talk about remediation, they're talking about microbials, your sewage backup cleanup. Again, your asbestos, your lead, all these have to be remediated before you dry, because by drying, you are moving air around. And this is what they say. And under this, contaminated environments can result from condition 2 or 3 mold contamination. And that reverts back to the S520. So, as I said, the Texas mold rules just got a supercharged upgrade. by the IICRC S520. Now, why did I cover all that in S520 about drying? Well, we do have some contractors and remediation people out there who are running around out there just doing a flood cut 4 foot everywhere, not putting a containment up, not doing nothing, not taking care of what they're supposed to. They're not paying attention to the asbestos rules, which I'm going to address in another video. Not taking care of the lead rules, which I'm going to take care of in another video. And they're definitely doing this to ignore the mold rules by saying it's a water issue. Water isn't a carcinogen. Water is not going to cause cancer. Water can cause death if we immerse you in it. Yes, that's true. Asbestos, lead, and mold has been shown to be health hazards. And in these books, all of them say, you must cease any activity, no matter what. You shall cease these activities whenever there is a risk to the worker, the restoration worker or remediation worker, or it's a violation of the rule. So you can't do illegal things. You can't violate the rule because of expediency. You just can't do that. That's not in here. It's not allowed. And if you're being honest with you, you can't say, what if I call it something else? They don't allow that. You're supposed to see what mold is. So one of the practices we saw in the Hurricane Harvey area is people are going in and flood cutting an entire house or apartment complex, and then the people are kind of stuck. They're stuck with because these guys are also paying build back. There's no third-party oversight, and they're going like, don't worry about the mold, it's exempted. Well, I'm going to get into that exemption process also with the IICRC requirements with mold remediation in qualifications. You're supposed to be following the rules. And there is now a lot of liability for people who said, yeah, we're following IICRC, yeah, we're certified, and they don't know what's in the standard. And that is a big issue. So the point is, there are people saying, well, I follow the standards. See, I'm really protective. Well, you're not really protective because you're just saying you're following the standards as a shield. But the shield's made out of cardboard, and it's not going to protect you from a good sword. And the good sword is knowing what's in here. If you're going to tilt, you better tilt the right way. So that is some of the parts. Now let me get into a couple of the other things in here as far as the IICRC S520 and some of the R520 stuff. One of the big things we have going on with, again, people calling mold water damage and then wholesale taking this stuff out. And again, this is basically facilitated by the posture of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation now. They're not enforcing much. It clearly is the thing. So one of the things I want to bring back is the standard here, okay? And also going to bring back the reference. And these are for the mold remediation. Again, for professional mold remediation. If you're not following these, you're not a professional. I'm just kidding. But we go to the section here. We get into the scope and purpose. Okay, and they've got a lot of definitions here. But we get into the principles of mold remediation. We've got a couple things going on. One, we have consultants not taking into consideration the water damage issue and cause of water. The other thing we have is we've got some consultants and some contractors who are running around spraying stuff around, killing mold, and calling it non-demolition removal. Well, this is it starts on page 17. It's the principles by which this book guides people. And it says, under contamination removal, it says here, 4.4, it's on page 18, and it says right here, I've got it written here in my cards too, it says, physically removing mold contamination is the primary means of mold remediation. Probably a state test question is my bet. Mold contamination should be physically removed from the structure, systems, and contents to return them to condition 1. Attempts to kill, encapsulate, or inhibit mold instead of proper source removal generally are not adequate. Okay? Remediation of structures and systems can be considered clean when contamination, unrestorable contaminated materials, and debris have been removed and surfaces are free of visible dust. Okay? That's very important. But we go into the R, the reference that supports that document, and the principles of mold remediation. This is on page 11 in the R520, if you're following along in your hymnal. And it says, 4, physically remove the mold contamination. It says the same thing, but here's where the key thing is. Mold contamination should be physically removed from the structure and contents to return them to condition 1. Attempts to kill or encapsulate mold are not adequate to solve the problem. This is the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, 1999. That is Mocker, and that is Bioaerosols Assessment and Control. So it's the bioaerosols book. It basically says, again, this spraying stuff around and killing mold is not effective. People can say it is. It doesn't follow IICRC. So anybody running around saying like, well, we're taking care of mold by water damage and then we're spraying a bunch of stuff to kill it, you haven't remediated it because you didn't follow any of the standards. And most of these companies put in just a CYA to cover their rear ends. They put in, we follow IICRC S520, and they don't even know that they're not. Well, see me in court. I'm available for expert witnessing, and I know this. And other people who are quoting it don't. Number 5 is also another big one here. Correct the moisture problem to prevent recontamination. Since mold spores are present to background levels, etc., to prevent this, moisture problems shall be identified, located, and corrected or controlled as soon as possible. Successful mold remediation results in returning remediated structure condition 1. Reconstruction does not normally begin until moisture is controlled and mold remediation is complete. And that's within R500. So as you run around, you see these things start referencing themselves. You keep running into the same thing. You're supposed to follow the rules and follow the standards. And where you don't follow the standards, you then have to go ahead and document why you're not. So it's as I said, it's a really good set of standards, and it really does, as I said, give a supercharged upgrade to the Texas Mold Assessment and Remediation rules. Okay, and it also says source removal should always be the primary means of remediation. Indiscriminate use of chemicals is not recommended. And that's on page 20, the IICRC S520 5.8.1.1. It's a limitation of chemicals. Antimicrobials should not be used as an alternative to cleaning processes and physical removal. So it's very, very straightforward in all aspects of this. Now, other things we're going to get into, negative pressure and air scrubber mode. I've read through both of these, and I don't see anywhere where the IICRC S520 or R520 allows scrubber mode alone. That means there's no negative pressure. And the way I see this, and the way I'm reading it, and we can reply in the comments, if you will, about the negative pressure. The way I'm reading it, air scrubbing is not, unless you have remember, you can deviate from the standard, and I don't consider that a big deviation as long as you still have containment as well. So we also have the couple of different areas I'm going to read is the IEP Indoor Environmental Professional Determinations and the issues for S520 and R520, and then also the qualifications and regulations. I'm going to find and read those two in here as well. So that's the next section we're going to get into. All right, now when people, I ask my classes, what are these about? What are these guidance documents about? Well, in the condition 1 or condition 2 or condition 3, one of the big things about what these requirements are is, do I really need an IEP involved? And that's a fair enough question. The issue of what this looks like as well. Condition 1 is just probably wet. May have some mold here or there, but not that big a deal. Or we have condition 3. A hurricane strike area, house was flooded, you got a 6-foot water line, and you got 8 feet of mold in there. Crawling up the walls and all over everything. The question is, if I don't have any regulations, do I really need an indoor environmental professional if the whole building is just wet? Or if the whole building is moldy? If the whole building's involved, why do you need somebody to come in and go like, I need to do this, 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 this? Because you're going to take out all the moldy stuff. The contractor can make those decisions. Now, they still probably shouldn't clear themselves as well. And the IICRC S520 is very clear on this, but it's not very clear when you have to kind of go through both of them and go through the documents on when an IEP is needed. So where you start is the condition 1, normal fungal ecology. If it's normal fungal ecology, it just got wet, dry it out. Condition 3, the entire structure or area is completely moldy, go for it. With the exception of when you have rules, because you have to follow the rules when they have them. It's very clear, stated over and over and over in these documents. So here's a statement on documenting the work conditions and work processes in the principles. And it says, spores that disperse from condition 3 areas and settle on surfaces in other areas may create contaminated conditions where they can accumulate. These areas are referred to as condition 2. It is not possible to differentiate between condition 2 and condition without areas, appropriate sampling or technical testing methods by an IEP. And that's really what this whole book is about. When does a contractor, should or shall they involve an indoor environmental professional? And it's basically when you cannot determine condition 3 throughout a structure or condition 1 throughout a structure. Because condition 1, it's not mold remediation, and it's condition 3, everything goes. And that's really what it is. And that's why the contiguous square feet is not an issue, because remember, this is dealing with contamination also, dispersed, which really hasn't been addressed as much as it should have been. Okay, this is another one. This is on 93 in Chapter 8 in the R520. And it says, the assessment of conditions 1, 2, or 3 by a remediator on a project where the mediator has been contracted to perform remediation services can create a conflict of interest, period. Ethical considerations such as an assessment inappropriate and legislation can make it illegal. Well, since we have Texas rules, it'd be illegal to do so. You can still determine whether or not you have mold, but you still have to bring in an IEP in Texas, a mold assessment consultant, because the law requires it. Therefore, remediators should not act as their own IEP. In addition, remediators shall comply with applicable federal, state, provincial, or local laws. So again, you come across mold and drying, you're supposed to call it mold. You're not supposed to continue active drying until it's finished up. So that says right there, if you got a problem with that, you need to talk to these guys, not leave me an ugly comment. It's them. That's what they say. Another one we get into is gas phase ozone or vapor biocides. This is in the R520. According to the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, no gas or vapor phase biocides can effectively or safely remediate a microbially contaminated building because of problems with biocide delivery, efficacy, and toxicity. Studies have shown that ozone cannot be generated in sufficient concentration to kill or even suppress microbials on most structural members, including wood and drywall. Okay, and ozone has been shown to increase submicron particles that adverse effect, meaning ozone is an oxidizer. It's going to break materials up, as well as cause many types of damage to many artifacts. So it's very clear that just spraying stuff around, as I said before, it's in the standard. And most of these people spraying crap around are quoting IICRC S500, and they are quoting it wrong. Now, as a final here, getting into the last two sections in complying with the rules and regulations, we've already talked about the IEP determinations. Now, in the state of Texas or where you have state rules, it's a moot point. Contractors can't do it. They have to stay on their side of the street. So here is one of the things that comes up repeated in all these books. Principles of water damage restoration. Water damage building materials and the investigation and performance of water damage restoration can create and expose workers to a wide range of health and safety concerns. Potential hazards include, but not limited to, exposure to microbial contaminants, chemicals, lead and asbestos, electrical shock, slip, trip, and fall hazards, Appropriate safety procedures and PPE shall be used. Reasonable efforts should be made to inform the building occupants and protect them from the identified health and safety issues. Now, there's several places in here where it says you may not risk the employees. So the qualifications and regulations section, this is pretty easy in this particular standard. It's in 24 and 25 in the S520. And on page 24 it says remediator qualifications. Licensing requirements for mold remediation work vary by county, state, provincial, and municipality. Remediators shall possess the necessary license to satisfy federal, state, provincial, and local laws. Business license. Local business licenses are frequently required for doing businesses. Remediators shall comply. So again, the only way they wouldn't comply with the rule is basically saying, well, I got to break the law, and here's my reason for breaking the law. One of the issues we get into is the Hurricane Harvey area. It's been over 3 years, and we still have a disaster declaration in those areas. The emergency is long gone. It's long over. And the way I read this is, well, by now, under the IICRC S520, these guys are no longer qualified. If they are instituting the IICRC S520 and still operating under the exceptions and exemptions, they need to be letting their people know that they're dealing with it. And some of the materially affected people would be the Department of Insurance. They would need to know so they could tell their insurance companies that people are not getting that particular issue. And also on 7.2.2, certification, the state of Texas does not recognize the AMRT. It doesn't recognize any training other than from the 6 training providers in the state of Texas. That's the way they wanted. They wanted our regulations and our stuff done. And now we're doing IICRC S520. But it says here, various governmental bodies require certification as a requirement for performing mold remediation services. Remediators shall be aware and comply with applicable laws and regulations. In the absence of specific legal requirements, certification is recommended for those engaged in mold remediation. And we got people go like, well, I took the class. I follow IICRC S520. And it says here, the S520 does not attempt to teach mold remediation procedures, but rather provides principles and foundations for understanding proper remediation practices. It is not a substitute for remediation training or certification programs that are necessary, which again, the state of Texas Department of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation should have probably read the foreword first before they said, we're using this for certification. The ANSI IICRC is not intended to establish procedures or criteria for assessing mold. So anybody who's saying they're assessing mold by IICRC S520, this is about the remediation side of it. Okay, so that's that part. Let's go back, let's go one more section into 8. And we get into the regulations, safety and health. Protecting safety, health of remediators and building occupants is of paramount importance. In the United States and other countries, there are laws. You must comply with OSHA standards. Fall protection, asbestos, lead standard, all of it, confined space. The rules are the rules. You got to comply with them. And again, you're supposed to be aware. You shall comply with these regulations. And if you're not, you have to document why you're deviating from OSHA on your job sites as well. So we're going to get in a little bit more on the asbestos and lead in the others. And the point of my presentation here is not to go on a tirade on how bad this is. This is not, again, I opposed having this be put in the state test because it required people to buy these. But now we're in it. We're in it at the direction of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. And so the Texas rules, as I have said several times to this, have been given a supercharged upgrade. There should be no more mold remediation done with spraying crap around. IICRC disallows it, clearly. ACGIH disallows it. Second thing is, we don't deal with square footage, so just be quiet about square footage. You've got to worry about hidden mold, concealed mold, mold contamination, and dispersed spores and fragments. Condition 2. That's our big concern. The next thing is, again, the water source must be identified and corrected. And My bet is I think the Texas Department of Insurance is probably going to be taking a bigger look-see in what's going on with the practice of mold consulting and mold remediation in the state of Texas and CMDRs that have been issued under these things. All they got to go back is look at the protocol. And did the protocol say IICRC? And that's one of the things the consultants are going to have to determine. If they said IICRC, are they validating it? Just as a last thing I'm going to cover in the book and just show you that people don't know what they're talking about when they say, oh yeah, we follow IICRC S500. Okay, that's what we do. We follow IICRC S500. Got to do that, you know, it's a standard. So one of the things we hear all the time is we follow IICRC S520. Now haven't been getting beat over the head for the last year and a half over this, and I had to learn it in order to teach it. And one of the things in learning it is reading it. And so I read it. I asked pretty much all of my clients who come in, and anybody who's asking me about the IICRC S500, I say, what thickness of poly does IICRC recommend for the floor? 4 mil, 6 mil? Go ahead, you can take time. Well, it says right here, isolation barriers are usually constructed of 4 mil or 6 mil polyethylene for walls and ceilings. So again, 4 mil for walls, 6 mil for ceilings. However, again, EPA basically said 6 mil. Okay, and 10 mil polyethylene for the floors are usually. Thinner poly may be used for temporary tearaway protection of surfaces. Fire retardant polyethylene with a minimum flame spread of 25 should be used to reduce fire hazards. So there it is. If you're following the recommendations and following IICRC, you probably ought to be putting 10 mil on floors if you're protecting floors. And 10 mil is a lot more expensive. So that's really where I started from. Again, people, this is how I got into this, where, you know, I had a lot of clients. Well, we follow IICRC S520. Do you use 10 mil on the floor? So that's pretty much it for this. I'm sure this will probably get a lot of discussion if the video starts getting passed around. As I said, I read directly from the standard. If you got problems with what the standard says, you got problems with what the standard says. And if you need more fill in with the Texas rules, well, there's another video there that I did under Texas under the Times Dark Captains company and YouTube channel. And there's going to be probably a BitChute and a Rumble Times Dark Captains channel as well. I lost a few subscribers in the Great Purge of 2021. So, and I'm not the only one. There's a lot of people who lost in that little cultish purge of social media here. And tons of content providers on the internet lost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. I'd say billions. Some people lost half their damn audience. So this is one of the reasons why, again, I'm not a believer in censoring of information. This needs to get out, and you should have a free discussion as long as we're fairly civil about what it is. You can call me an idiot. It doesn't hurt me, so it doesn't help me either. But anyway, this particular video is over, and I appreciate your continued viewership. If you like what you have, if you like this, go ahead and share it. I don't require people to hit notification bells and do all that Pavlovian stuff and notifications and blah, 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 all the internet stuff. I mean, have your own life. Think your own thoughts. Read Fahrenheit 451. So, till later, farewell.